All right, diving right in. This deep dive tackles something pretty major, something fundamental to, well, our democracy, right? We're talking about the right to vote.
Absolutely. And specifically, we're looking at this recent Supreme Court decision, the one that's kind of sent shock waves, I guess you could say, through Mississippi. And it has, the potential to really impact voting rights across the whole country.
Yeah, and, I was reading about this, and it's all stemming from, that Mississippi law, right?
Yep.
The one that permanently takes away the right to vote for people convicted of certain felonies. And they challenged this all the way to the Supreme Court, top of the top.
That they did. And the Supreme Court, well, they decided to let that law stand, which, on the surface, it might seem pretty straightforward. But trust me, this is anything but straightforward. I mean, we're talking about a law that affects like roughly 50,000 people just in Mississippi alone. And many of those people, they've served their time.
Wow, 50,000 people. So, okay, the Supreme Court basically said, yeah, that law, you can keep it. But I was reading that they didn't actually say if the law itself is constitutional.
Right. That's what makes this whole thing, so tricky. They basically said it's up to Mississippi lawmakers to decide if they want to change it. It's a matter of jurisdiction, you see.
Jurisdiction. So, like, the Supreme Court is saying, not my problem. It's Mississippi's problem.
Yeah, pretty much. They deferred to the state legislature on this. And, it might seem kind of like a, technicality or whatever, but this has huge implications. Think of it like a referee not making a call during, a crucial moment in a game. It just leaves everyone kind of hanging.
Okay, yeah, that analogy, that makes sense. But before we get too deep into all the legal stuff, I think it's important to remember that we're talking about real people here, right? People being denied this basic right.
Oh, absolutely. It's crucial to keep that in mind. Like, take, for instance, I was looking at this case, Robert, right? He served his time for a nonviolent drug offense. This was years ago.
Yeah.
He rebuilt his life, got a job, family, pays taxes, you name it. He contributes to his community, but he can't vote. It's like this law made him, a second-class citizen.
Yeah, yeah. It's easy to get caught up in the legalese sometimes and forget about the human impact. And you mentioned nonviolent offenses. This isn't just about, like violent criminals, right?
That's right. Mississippi's law, it disenfranchises people for a whole bunch of crimes, including, well, things like forgery, timber theft, even bigamy, believe it or not. These are offenses that in tons of other states, you wouldn't lose your voting rights.
Wow. Okay, so this law, it's been around for a while, right? It goes all the way back to Mississippi's 1890 Constitution. That was, if I remember correctly, a time of a lot of racial discrimination in the South.
That's exactly. 1890, yeah. This was during the time when a lot of southern states, after the Reconstruction era, they were actively trying to take away voting rights from Black citizens. So, they instituted poll taxes, literacy tests, and, yep, you guessed it, taking away voting rights from people convicted of, certain crimes. It was all very strategic. They were targeting Black citizens to limit their political power.
Okay, so looking at Mississippi today, it seems like this law is still having a pretty big, a disproportionate impact on Black Mississippians today.
Absolutely. So Mississippi, about 38% of the population is Black. But if you look at who is disenfranchised by this law, Black people make up over half of them. So
Right.
yeah, the law, it doesn't say race, explicitly, but the impact, well, it's definitely racialized.
It's like this, ghost of Jim Crow is still hanging around at the voting booths in Mississippi.
I like that. That's a great analogy. And this is where, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson comes in, right? Remember last year, in that related case, she had that dissenting opinion, and she argued that the specific crimes on Mississippi's list, well, she argued they were chosen specifically to discriminate. It was like an echo of what they were doing back in the Jim Crow era.
So she's basically saying they found a loophole to keep disenfranchising Black voters.
Exactly. She's really emphasizing the historical context, and she's arguing that you can't separate this law from its racist roots.
So we have this law. It's got these clear ties to discrimination, and we have a Supreme Court justice. She's saying it's discriminatory, and the Supreme Court, they do nothing. I don't get it.
Well, Mississippi, they argued that the Supreme Court has already upheld states' rights to restrict voting for felons in the past. They're basically saying, we're not doing anything new here. This is, completely within our rights as a state.
So it's a states' rights issue.
That's what they're arguing, yeah. But what's interesting and maybe a little unsettling is that the justices, they didn't actually comment on this specific case. They just, they declined to hear it, which leaves everyone wondering, what does this mean for voting rights?
So, okay, that's a lot to unpack. Where does this leave us?
Well, the Supreme Court's decision, or I guess you could say their non-decision, it leaves a lot of questions unanswered. The law is still in place, right? So thousands of Mississippians are still disenfranchised. Many of them, as we've been talking about, are Black. And, this could set a precedent for other states to do the same thing.
So this is bigger than Mississippi. This could affect the whole country.
Exactly. And this raises a pretty important question for everyone listening. If the Supreme Court keeps deferring to states on these voting rights issues, what does that mean for voting rights in the U.S., as a whole? Are we headed towards this patchwork of voting laws where your right to vote depends on, where you live? Something to think about.
Yeah, definitely a lot to think about.
Absolutely.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Hopefully you learned something.
Always a pleasure.
Until next time.